the EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello, welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 31. I'd actually like to welcome back my friend Kat Hamilton, who was on the show twice last year, but I think most recently July 2020, so it's actually been a fair while. So welcome back, Kat.
We say recently, that feels like a long time ago.
Fairly, it's not even recent by any other year's standards, but it might as well be a different age, Sometime in the Gilded Age, Kat Hamilton was on this podcast.
Sure.
How are you doing, Kat? You all right?
I'm great. It's so good to be back on. Thank you for welcoming me back.
That's all right.
Thanks for still being my friend.
Yeah, well, it was touch and go there for a bit. But I thought I'd stick it out for another few months. Yeah, it's funny. I say you haven't been on the show since last summer, but I was going to mention everyone I have on the show, I let them as a standard podcast etiquette to sort of plug stuff that they're doing or like if they've got their own shows or whatever. But you're actually unique in this podcast so far in the sense that you were on it last year and then just upped and went off and started your own podcast.
I think you should take some credit for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying. Well, I'm actually going to shower credit on you actually, because I've just passed. This will be the 31st episode, and I've just passed the year mark, and you were very instrumental in helping me get this off the ground and learn how to do it. So before you were even doing your own. So, but partly because I'm interested. I think some listeners, especially ones who have their own podcast, might be interested in the sort of, is it what you Americans call inside baseball kind of
sure
chat
behind the scenes, the BTS.
Yeah, but I'm certainly interested, and I don't think we've had a lot of chance to chat about it really. Even though I should say I guest starred. Auto plugging begins. I guest starred on your podcast. I think we recorded one just before Christmas, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right. Just before Christmas, we did it on Porco Rosso by Hayao Miyazaki.
That's right.
Essentially, I made a good friend towards just before sort of quarantine hit, when people were sort of a little aware of COVID, and it wasn't a big thing. It hadn't made it big yet, And then when quarantine hit, my friend Joe and I became sort of quarantine buddies, and he got me back into watching anime, which I hadn't been watching since I was a kid, really. Had kind of forgotten that it was still around and still a thing, and of course has a huge following. And I had always been a really big fan of Studio Ghibli and of Miyazaki films. And then we started just going through and watching a ton of anime films. So we found out that the podcast name, The Anime Movie Podcast, was available. And I liked that it was straightforward. It got to the point. You know what to expect. So it's a weekly podcast, comes out every Monday, available on Spotify and iTunes and a few other places. And each week we discuss and review a different anime film. And it's amazing how much it's opened the world up for me as far as anime film is concerned. Because to me, anime film was Studio Ghibli. And I think for a lot of people on the periphery, that's true. But there are a lot of other directors and a lot of auteurs who are pretty interesting. So it's a little on the niche side. But if we do the sort of first 15 to 20 minutes of it, talking about a spoiler-free synopsis and discussing things in general. So if you just want an idea of what a film is going to be like, then you can listen to the first 15 or 20 minutes and come back and listen to the spoiler section later if you want a more in-depth discussion. Sometimes we research it really well and have some really interesting fun facts to bring to the table. And sometimes it's just us discussing, but we have very different points of view. So it can be a good time.
It's a great show, and I've enjoyed. It had that weird experience where I sort of Zoom met Joe now when we were recording our own thing, but I sort of had that strange experience of like listening to his voice quite a lot first because I've listened to a fair few episodes of your show before I actually sort of met him, and I still haven't actually met him. So you've got these different layers of reality now that we're all tunneling through. You guys have a great dynamic, and it's you both bring very different things to the show, but you have tons of stuff where you can vibe with each other, and it's really it's very, very interesting. And I've been trying to I have broken this on some occasions, but I've generally been trying to only listen to the spoiler-free sections of your shows when I've not seen the movie. So there's quite a lot of, your shows where I've just heard the first half of it,
Yeah.
but I've been finding it very useful, and it's really, next time I have time, I've basically got this like laundry list now of like, anime movies to watch and catch up with, because I'm a real neophyte. I've got so many I could watch, but I kind of wanted to ask a couple of things really, but like, one of the big differences between this show, between the Scapegoat podcast and your show, is that I know you've been having guests on recently and sort of expanding the stable there and the diversity on it there. But the main difference between this show and yours is that you basically have a stable podcasting partner.
That's true. Yeah.
Which I can imagine that I mean, for me, as the grass is always greener, I can imagine that being a huge benefit in terms of, ease, because basically to get really inside of here, like a lot of the effort and kind of, I guess like challenge of this from my end is scheduling, really, like kind of, and I should say I'm talking to Kat now, and Kat's in LA, I'm in London, so you have, at the more ambitious end, you have time zone scheduling and things like that. But I mean, even just scheduling, really, getting people's time, especially because my show's a fairly long show, so you kind of, you need someone for a good chunk of an evening or a morning or whatever. And people work such different hours these days. And, all that's very tricky. And also one thing that I've started running into now is, now that I've just passed 30 episodes, is I've obviously had quite a wide range of people on. So I think probably a wider range than I really intended to have on. I had Kat on within, you were on the show by episode 5, but like some people were dragged into the mix, episode 10 or episode 20 or whatever. And what I realized now is I've got a rotating cast of characters who I really like. And, it's not, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I've really enjoyed working with every single one of them. But I kind of want to give them all fair dues now. And I kind of want them to bring them back in an equal number. And, I don't want some to not do it for, 8 months or whatever. But realistically, if I'm doing a kind of informal rota, that's kind of what has to happen. And it's kind of, it's throwing up some like diplomatic challenges, I think, mostly in my head. But, just kind of, I almost feel like I've accidentally created this like little sort of squadron of willing podcasters, and actually the massively helpful thing is when people do what you do, Kat, and just go and start their own, so I don't have to worry about them anymore. That's very helpful.
Well, it's kind of like you're the main character of a sitcom, but everybody else in the cast is a recurring character.
Which is always how I've imagined my life anyway. It's how most
Sure.
sociopaths function, That's how we get through. But what is it like? I guess what are the benefits and what are the challenges of recording with kind of one steady co-host?
I think, especially with both of us being sort of quarantine buddies throughout the Great Quar, as they say, there was a lot of time on our hands. So, watching movies and talking about it was pretty easy. Now that things are opening up again, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do some of the scheduling. But Joe and I hang out on a weekly basis. We hang out on Tuesday nights and Friday nights, and we go to the same outdoor exercise class. And so we sort of schedule our hanging out around going to that class and then, chilling afterwards. But now that things have gotten a little busier, that's also our only time to record if we want to. And at some point, we'd been recording a couple of times a week, so we had a lot in the can, so to speak. So, I'd be going back and being like, oh, let's do this episode next week, and I'd edit it and realize, oh, this is already dated based on some of the things that we were talking about in it.
Yeah.
And of course, as time went on and we saw more and more films, I'd hear myself say something and be like, oh, that's not accurate.
Yeah.
But, now I think we're just running up against a time where we need to start recording again on a consistent basis in order to get episodes out weekly. And I think you went to once every other week or so to kind of keep up with it, didn't you?
It's funny you should mention that. I made that decision. It was, the absolute infancy of this podcast, but I'd started doing them weekly up till your episode that you were on. And It was partly because that was I think the longest episode at the time, that I'd done, but also you were kind of, I was already starting to learn basic editing proficiency and things like that. But you being a professional editor really helped me along with that. And, you remember that episode, you kind of really gave me kind of a working tutorial, didn't you, in a lot of respects about how much work needed to be put into an episode for it to sound halfway decent, really.
Yeah, it's
And
a lot.
it was a lot, yeah. And I really appreciate that, by the way. That's really great. A real turbo boost, I think, in terms of my own proficiency. But actually, what that made me realize was just I'm going to need a bit more time with these, because I was barreling along, and I think it was that week I was like, I've got to have to. I did one more, I think, weekly, and then I was just like, that's it now. Because fortnightly is quite a lot, when you take a show like this. So that, as I say, arranging it socially and stuff. I mean, do you have any? How far ahead are you? So have you only got a couple of episodes in the can now, ahead of where you are with releases? Or
Yeah, this year we tried to do some themes. So we did like Ghibli January, and we did Makoto Shinkai all February, because all of his films have to do with love and relationships. I think we did Mamoru Hosoda March. So you're trying to do things thematically. So right now we have a gap for this month where we need to actually record in order to fill a spot this month. And then next month in May, we're doing a series on memories, which is 3 different films by 3 different directors, all based on mangas by one person, that all kind of thematically fit together in some way. So, but they're pretty short, and that's fairly easy. But then after that, we won't have any, but we're probably going to do Ghibli June. So, and there's so many Ghibli films to choose from that we haven't covered yet at all. I think that one of the challenges of working with somebody all the time and being close friends with them is sometimes it's difficult to not take things personally, especially if there's a film that you really love or is really important to you. There was one episode we just had to scrap. We still haven't re-recorded because we got so mad at each other. and
we're plates thrown.
Almost, nearly. Emotional plates were thrown.
Which movie was that?
That was Spirited Away, which isn't a particularly controversial film. It's widely regarded as very good.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. But Joe just thought it was trash.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you should totally respect people's opinions on films. There's a film that you love, somebody else doesn't love it, but there's a way to go about it that isn't inflammatory. And I wouldn't say that's how he went about it. I don't know what was going on for him, but it brought up some stuff for him. But then that brought up some stuff for me. So there's that part of it. I think that can be challenging. But then you also fall into these really comfortable rhythms with episodes where you bounce off of each other well, and you kind of know how to set the other person up for to say something funny, or to get some interesting content. So I think you kind of become these like familiar characters within your podcast, that it's like, oh, that's such a Joe thing to say, and that's quite fun.
you become versions of yourself to an extent, don't you? I mean, in the same way that we all have several dozens of versions of ourselves that we play in terms of social relationships, and work relationships. You kind of become a podcast version of yourself, because I'm aware there is kind of a David now who is kind of specifically the EscapeGoat podcast David. That's kind of the way I talk on this, and the sort of rhythm of my speech, and the way I try and solicit, because in almost every episode I'm basically in the position of the de facto host / interviewer, and that's kind of I like to think I wear it lightly, but that is kind of what I'm doing, and it's not quite my natural self in a way. It's kind of
I think it's really fun to also have these sort of running jokes that are just within the podcast. For example, Joe didn't even notice this about himself, but whenever we were talking about how much more injured or dead a character should be based on the amount of bodily harm they've received in a certain period of time, which happens a lot in film and in anime films. But Joe started saying when he'd talk about a character and what they'd gone through, he'd always say, I mean, at least some broken ribs. and because I was editing it, I was listening to it back, and so I'd be like, this is like the 3rd or 4th time he's said this. So the next time it came up, before he said it, I went, so at least some broken ribs, right, Joe? And so it became this running thing where the at least some broken rib situation is when somebody has just been through the ringer and is somehow getting up and still functioning.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. It's funny your perspective on listening back to stuff as you're editing as well, isn't it? Because I actually did. This is the most embarrassing thing I'll ever say about this podcast. But today I was listening back to the previous. This will be the previous episode when it comes out, and I was listening to me and my brother talk about something, and my partner heard me laugh from the other room. And she said, "What are you laughing about?" And I said, "Just laughing at a funny thing I just said on the podcast." And, and I was like, "Oh, this is I really sunk low here. This is what I'm doing, for for a hobby. It's laughing at my own jokes. Great."
It is entertaining that at least, you can kind of find the consistencies where you're listening to something back and you have a thought in your head about something you would riff on. You're like, oh, look, I said it. There's a comfort to know that I always would make that joke.
Because you're actually a professional editor, and I know you're very, very skilled and very sort of exacting in the way you go about that. I mean, do you find that you're a bit of when it comes to the actual podcast, do you feel like you're too much of a completist, or do you feel like you can let that go when it's not a sort of for pay thing? Can you? I've
had to let it go a little bit, especially when work has gotten really busy. I used to be able to do little bits of editing throughout the week. And one thing that was nice about having a partner to do this with is that he took on the responsibility of creating little animations to go along with funny clips or interesting clips from the podcast. So throughout the week, I would find bits and I'd send it to him, and he'd animate them and he'd put them up on YouTube. And I found that as things got busier, I wasn't able to edit throughout the week. So most of my weekend went into editing. And when that happened, there were things that I had to let go of. It had to be like, it works, move on. Sort of a mentality, which you have to if you want to be efficient. And we do that in the professional world as well. Of course, you always get notes back to be able to fix some of those rougher bits later. But so I think there are some episodes where I spend a lot more time really finessing it, especially when we have a guest on. I try to make those sound as good as possible. And other ones, I just kind of have to look for peaking and just make sure that the audio levels are about right, and that I cut out bits where I sound especially dumb. No, I mean, there's not, it's not so much like that. There's sometimes I'll cut things out where I'm just like, I totally misunderstood what he was asking me, and this part doesn't make sense. And then you have that conversation back and forth. Like, did you understand what I said? No, So I pull some of that stuff out, and of course, now that I've been editing them so frequently and consistently, I have a better idea of what kind of length of time is actually reasonable. And, we try and keep it down to like an hour and 15, hour and 20 when we record now, when we used to, go 2 hours, and it just takes so much longer to edit. And also if we stumble over our words or if something gets confused, I've learned now to be like, all right, let's take that from the top. Let me start that sentence over to make it easier to pull out some of the buffoonery.
Because it's less work to sort of piece back together in a sense. Finesse.
Yeah. In reality television, we call it a Frankenbite, when you pull different words from different places to try and build something that somebody didn't say exactly as they said it. And it's a lot of work to make any of those sound good. So I don't want to do it.
You're not suggesting that TV editing can be somewhat deceptive, are you?
Oh, sure. But the BBC actually has quizzes and things that you have to take online in order to work on a BBC program. And they're very good about how you can do that, but it has to still have the spirit of what the person originally said. So you can make them say it better and cleaner, but you're not allowed to make them say something they never said. American television does not have those rules.
I see. I can imagine how far that gets stretched on occasion.
Oh, it's alarming.
I wanted to talk to you quickly about because as I say, you've had a few guests on the show, although it's mostly you and Joe. You've had a few guests on the show, some of whom have their own shows, and I wondered, are you running up against the thing that I've been dealing with occasionally, which is where you kind of you have like a wish list of guests. I mean, like both from your personal life and maybe from podcasts you listen to. I mean, is that the way you've been going about it? Have you and Joe both been throwing ideas in the hat about that sort of stuff? Or
yeah, absolutely. And normally Joe has a couple people in mind that he'd love to bring on. Often it's whether they have the technical equipment to be able to do so. If they have a mic to be able to do it from home over Zoom. But we've also discussed, sort of a list of guests and who might be best to talk about different movies or different concepts, or in some cases, who might be a best mediator. for example, with the upcoming Spirited Away podcast, which will happen in the next couple of months. And so we're choosing the best person who won't light a fire necessarily in either of us. Will be a third voice that won't just act as mediator, but adding a bit more balance to it so that we can really discuss it instead of it getting into an emotional, I like it, you don't like it, let's fight about it.
Very wise, very wise. I had one final question about the podcasting thing before you move on to the meat of the episode.
Sure.
I you know, because obviously my show's been just over a year now and yours is still under a year. So these are both kind of things that we've kind of done sort of on the spur of the moment, you know, in very specific circumstances. And neither of them have a necessary endpoint in a sense. You know, it's not like we're covering a finite group of things. Like,
we'll run out of anime movies at some point. We'll have to get creative, but sure.
Yeah, but not soon, you know. And
not soon.
I just wondered if, you know, because for example, the EscapeGoat podcast is an indefinite thing, but I'm already running into the sort of thing of where I'm kind of now that I've rounded the horn of the year once, it's kind of like, do I give myself a summer break? You know, do I put the show on hiatus for, you know, maybe July, August and like build up a bit of a catalog during that? So I come back, you know, with a bit more of a back catalog, what you call it, like a backlog.
Or like a season 2.
Yeah, kind of like a de facto season 2. And I think I haven't quite worked out the details yet. And the thing is, I've got some lined up that are more kind of to do with new things coming out. And I didn't do that deliberately, but now it's kind of, they're harder to put on the back burner because I want them to be fresh.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you and Joe had talked us all about, like, you know, are you aiming to get to, you know, 40 episodes, 50 episodes, 80 episodes, you know, more? Is there like a target like that, or are you just going to see how it goes, you know?
Yeah, we're just going to see how it goes. You know, and I've thought about doing something like a hiatus, but I'm a little worried that if we took a hiatus, we wouldn't pick it back up. You know, other things would fill our time since we've spent so much time each week doing this, both watching the films and talking about them, doing the animations, doing the editing, you know, for the podcast. But I think it's probably wise to take a break sometimes. And in some ways, because we got such a huge back catalog and then we're recording very sporadically, it feels like we've kind of taken a hiatus. You know, there was a bit of a recording hiatus for a while, even though there wasn't an editing hiatus. Sometimes I think an editing hiatus would be healthy for me because, you know, every episode, there's at least 6 hours of editing time that goes into it, listening back and adjusting levels. And I also have recently discovered a really nice noise reduction software that can take out some of the static and make a lot of the audio for the dialogue to be really crisp and warm and clean, which has been a huge help, especially with some of the older episodes we have on mics that weren't quite as good. So I think
you're doing a George Lucas on some of the older episodes, are you? You're doing like putting some digital creatures in the background and things
That's
like that.
right, yeah. I mean, Joe did a podcast with a friend of his, Joe Welke and Vance Tucker, called Boys Watching Girls, and they watch every episode of HBO's Girls and review and discuss. And they started that a month or two before quarantine, and now they've watched every episode. And so it's been interesting to watch them still wanting to podcast together and seeing the sort of topics that they end up, you know, adding to the back end of that. And I've kind of wondered if that would ever happen to us when we sort of run out of anime movies. I mean, we can get really, really obscure. It's already kind of obscure sometimes anyway. But I think that you do kind of have to adapt and open it up after it's been running for a while. And they've done things like talking about character arcs over the entire series. And they watched a film by Lena Dunham. I think it's called Tiny Furniture.
Oh yeah, I've never seen that. I've always meant to. Yeah.
And talked about that over an episode. And then they did a Q&A episode with, you know, listener questions, you know, so they're continuously coming up with more ideas of how to like really keep it going. But I do think at some point there's not much more you can say about HBO Girls.
No. Can you imagine how excited they'll be if Dunham announced it was coming back for a one-off or something? It'd just be like, you know, live on air.
Those specials are always bad. I feel like, especially in British television, that happens where you get the Christmas special of something. I think there was a Jonathan Creek Christmas special that was just terrible. I think they did it for Blackadder.
Yeah, they sure did. That's a classic, that one. You know, I think Jonathan Creek has come up about 4 times on this podcast with different people. There's some sort of thread running through this show.
I think when I was introduced to Jonathan Creek, I was told, now, this isn't good. Like, good's not the word you'd use for this, but it's very watchable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. My first girlfriend, who I hope's not listened to the show, my first serious girlfriend, she said at the time when we were teenagers that one of the things she liked about me was that I reminded her of Alan Davis because of the curly hair. I think that's it, you know. And you actually see, you know, because I've not been to the barbers yet after lockdown, you're seeing it, it's full spread now. It's probably quite similar to how it was when I was 17, actually. But you know, I didn't watch Jonathan Creek myself, so I never knew how accurate that comparison was.
Have you still not watched it?
I've seen, no, it's one of those shows that I've always just caught like 10 minutes of when I was growing up and stuff like that. You know? Yeah. I've had people say that I would like it, you know.
I'm a little surprised. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's really fun about that show is the fact that it's this sort of Sherlock Holmes level of piecing things together that are just impossible and get ridiculous. And, you know, there's one thing about, you know, the whole meaning of a note changed because there was a bug that was on the note that looked like an apostrophe or something, or a comma, which completely changed the meaning of something. And that's the reason why this thing happened. And it's just these like really cartoonish ideas of solving a mystery, which are really over the top. But have you ever seen any of those TV graph things you can find online that rate shows, where you can go to an episode or you can go to a series and you can see a graph of the ratings of the episode?
Oh, right. No,
and it's really fun, especially if you want to go back and be like, I just want to watch a couple episodes of something I haven't seen in a while. Then you can go back and like pick a couple of the best rated episodes to watch. Right.
So you can see like when the not objectively, obviously, but when the sort of aggregate of subjective opinions says that the show is going through a golden age kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you can also see when it just plummets, you know, which is pretty entertaining to look at. But Jonathan Creek goes all over the place. Just a constant roller coaster of a graph.
I had a huge, I think Jonathan, as far as I remember reading, Jonathan Creek has 2 assistants in that show, and they are, you know, very like Doctor Who-esque actually. But I think one of them's Julia Sawalha, who I had a huge crush on growing up, because she played Lydia in the 90s BBC Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
And she was in, you know, Absolutely Fabulous and things like that. You know, but I believe she's one of the people, Caroline Quentin being the other one. But so for that reason alone, maybe I'll check it. I'll look at those graphs and I'll check out some of the good episodes from her run. You know,
we can watch it together. Then we can start a Jonathan Creek podcast.
Oh, no more podcasts. We can't do any more podcasts.
But David, imagine the Jonathan Creek podcast.
I mean, I am now. Yeah, this is annoying. I mean, that's one that, before we move on, that's one of the things I think of as perhaps optimistically with the EscapeGoat podcast, is that every episode, every pairing, at least every sort of combination of people is kind of a prospective pilot in a sense. You know, maybe not about that topic, but with that kind of dynamic of people. You know, and actually one of the joys of having the rotating guests is that I do get to recombine them. You know. And kind of go, you know, like either these people already know each other socially, or this thing sort of struck a chord where actually that person would like to talk to that person. And, you know, it's becoming a fun, I hope sometimes alchemical kind of environment for people, you know, where they sort of hear, just, you know, do you remember like when we used to have social lives, that like kind of like that?
And also it must be a great way to keep in contact with some of the people that you really enjoyed talking to at one time or another in your life about the things that are important to you, or that are fun, or make you tick, or make you think.
Yeah, it's good, and I think actually, it's particularly people like yourself who are geographically, you know, and have been geographically distant from me for several years now, but I think it's encouraging us to keep in touch more, because obviously if you're trying to schedule stuff together, you keep in touch just logistically, but then you tend to chat a bit around that, and you kind of check in more with how each other are doing, and you actually end up having some ridiculous chats and stuff, and I think that all helps. But obviously these times when I actually get to see you face to face, it's great, you know, it's really invaluable, and it's kind of something that I don't know if I'm a bit too British to engineer otherwise, you know. There sort of needs to be a purpose behind it, you know.
Anyway, great podcast bridge that you've engineered.
Yeah, it looks like it. But anyway, I'll let you. That's really interesting, Kat. Thanks for talking to me through that. I'll let you plug it properly at the end of the show. Plug the podcast after we finish talking. But the reason I'll just say to the listeners, so I asked Kat to come back on the show. And this is kind of a at least theoretical or hopeful part one of what will be a two-part podcast, we hope. And that's partly because I was talking to her about the Legend of Zelda game series, because I had it in my head that I wanted to talk, and indeed we will be talking today about the Ocarina of Time, the N64, absolute classic, kind of slightly intimidating level of classic, really, when it comes down to game journalism. But hopefully we'll have a fresh take on it. But I wanted Kat to have the opportunity to then, reciprocally get to talk about her favorite Zelda game, which is it's Twilight Princess, isn't it, on the Wii?
It is Twilight Princess, which I have to be really careful to say Twilight, because the number of people who thought I've said Toilet Princess who were unfamiliar with the Zelda series is innumerable. Well, I probably could count, but
Toilet Princess is my OnlyFans account. But I won't get into that here. I would say to Kat that, like, I think the interesting thing about talking about this game and then Twilight Princess, hopefully in a few months, is that analyzing two games in a series that are kind of far enough apart to have a lot of technical innovations and like gameplay innovations.
Oh, absolutely.
It'll be really interesting, but also kind of, one that meant a lot to you at a certain stage in your life versus one that meant a lot to me at a different stage,
Yeah, and I think that they go together very well, because Twilight Princess in a lot of ways has the same game map as Ocarina of Time. And a lot of it, when I was playing Twilight Princess for the first time, was like, oh, this is somebody who went back and was like, what if we did this with today's graphics? I want to see Lake Hylia, but see it in this beautiful, many, many pixeled environment.
Yeah.
So they pair really well together. I think also because Ocarina of Time has this time traveling aspect where you take on these two different personas, an adult version of Link and the child version of Link. And in Twilight Princess, you have the wolf body and Link's body, and the functions of the character and the things that you're able to do in each body change. And so I think that both games really kind of mirror each other.
That's so fascinating and such a nice preview of whenever we do that episode. And I say whenever we do that episode because if there's one thing the last few weeks have taught me, it's that you need a fair bit of time to dip back into these games. Because
oh my god, yeah,
me and Kat had a couple of delays recording this episode, and I'm so glad we did, because I think I sort of hubristically was like, because I've got an N64 in the house, I was like, I'll pick Ocarina of Time up again, I'll play it, for a couple of nights a week, and that'll give me a taste of it. And I was like, and then like a week into that, I was like, oh god, there's a lot of this, isn't there? And then 2 weeks later, I was like, yeah, I'm really stuck on this, like not only getting stuck at difficult bits, but I'm really into this now. And I was kind of, as we speak, I'll get into this, but like I was playing it earlier today, and I'm basically trying to do the last temple. That's where I am.
Oh, so, wow.
And that by no means. Well, yeah. There's loads of stuff still to do. I mean, this is me kind of scraping the surface in terms of like the side quests and fetch quests and things like that. But I'm trying to do the sort of main spine of the game, and even that's taken me the best part of most spare time that I've mustered in like the last 3-4 weeks. So it's quite a thing. But I look forward to giving Twilight Princess the due it needs. Because I've of course never played that one. So
yeah, and I'd love to dive back in. With Twilight Princess, I bought it at the beginning of an Easter break when I wasn't going home from uni, and I spent 2 weeks playing it, and I must have put in 12-hour shifts on the daily playing that game, and largely ignoring my boyfriend at the time, which he was upset about. But I couldn't put it down. But that was still, over 10 years ago now. And the last time I played Ocarina of Time was even longer before that. But in order to prepare for today, I ended up reading, here and there, a couple of articles, but also watching all of the cutscenes in a row, which is available on YouTube from a couple of different YouTube users, which was kind of a weird experience because you're not getting anything between the setup and the payoff of every event of the game. So you get the explanation for why you're going to do a thing, and then it cuts to like, you've done the thing. So I have a lot of details missing for the middle bits of those. But it reminded me of a lot of things that I had completely forgotten.
That's funny for your show as well, that you've essentially ended up watching a very short, very perfunctory anime movie, like a very
I mean,
scouter
it's
one.
still an hour and 47 minutes, I
There's a lot
think.
going on.
I mean, it's the length of an actual movie.
It's true. I mean, there are quite a lot of cutscenes. But actually, it's funny. It's good actually in a way that we started off talking about your podcast, because I think it ties quite nicely to discuss the Zelda franchise when you're talking about animated depiction, like Japanese depictions of sort of mythical landscapes
Sure.
and fairy tale narratives, because obviously that's a lot of what anime turns its hand to, is kind of revamping mythos from maybe other parts of the world and kind of finessing them. And I think was it you I was messaging, and I was saying that if in a way you could sort of simplify things and say that two Japanese companies have had huge effects on the sort of modern international mind, in a sense, and they're probably arguably Studio Ghibli and Nintendo in slightly different ways.
Sure, and you could also say things like Sony.
True, very true. Yeah. Well, no, I'm still too much of a tribalist to give Sony any credit.
I see.
When you grow up in the '90s, you just you pick a side and you refuse to acknowledge that the other one exists. They have a Bandicoot or something. I don't know.
Sure. I think watching the cutscenes reminded me of how there's like little bits of humor in this game that are almost entirely based around the free will that you have to say no in random situations, which will not allow you to progress forward in the game, and you can just mildly offend a CPU character for a second, which I had forgotten about the game and is actually really charming.
Yeah. It's kind of like it's almost like a limitation of open worldism, isn't it? That's turned into quite a nice feature. Because I mean there are. Well, I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. I'll get into talking about Ocarina of Time, and I'm glad you've touched on both the world map and the time travel element already, because those are both, I've got those earmarked as like sections of the show basically, because I want to talk to you about both of those.
Sure.
But I just wanted to. So I recently guest starred on my friend George's YouTube channel. And I was talking about, so this actually pairs rather nicely, actually, because I was talking about my initial home computer experience, which was with the Commodore Amiga 500 back in the early 90s. So we're talking about sort of, for me, it was like 92, 93, that kind of period. And it was my introduction to home gaming, really, apart from glimpsing it at other people's houses. And this was in the period before, just before me and my brother got Super Nintendos a little bit late, and Sega Mega Drives. And this built up to the N64 era for me. I know, I mean, you're a few years younger than me, Kat, but I just wanted to say, like, well, sort of focusing on the late 90s, maybe, like, what was your kind of initial, maybe first experiences with gaming in that sort of period? How did you come to it?
It was definitely Nintendo based, and then it also became PlayStation based later on. I can't remember when my sister got into it, but I'm sure that it was my older sister getting into it, and therefore getting me into it. I know you call it a SNES, but we call it an SNES for the Super Nintendo. Which I thought,
I think the British
SNES
tend to say
really
SNES.
Silly.
Yeah, it is.
But essentially, we received some gaming systems for sort of Christmas or birthdays, and it kind of traded off. So my sister got the NES, and then the SNES was mine, and then I believe the N64 was given to my sister. Mm-hmm. And later on, my sister took the SNES somewhere, and I got really mad, even though I think I was in college, and she took it from my dad's house and took it somewhere else. But, of course, the SNES was a very 2D platform, and it was a lot like an old arcade game that just, sort of moved in two directions, but mostly forward. Mm-hmm. And, of course, at the N64, then you got these 3D environments, which was so cutting edge, for us. And I think that there were a lot of games available that had a lot of breadth of experience in terms of, sort of action adventure, but also narrative and feeling like you're really in the world. And I think that really appealed to me as an early gamer. And when PlayStation came into our lives, then my sister got really into Final Fantasy VII. I really, really liked Final Fantasy X, and we also played Dance Dance Revolution. So between the two of us, there was a lot of Super Mario Brothers, a lot of Zelda, and dancing games, role-playing games. And I think that those tend to appeal more frequently to a broader audience. Mm-hmm. I remember pulling out an old N64 in college, and, somebody was like, "Do you have GoldenEye?" And I was like, "What?" And I think for a lot of boys, like, GoldenEye was like such a, big step in the first person shooter world, and it was just
Mm-hmm.
not on these two girls lists at
Sure,
all
yeah.
as far as like the N64 was concerned.
I suppose GoldenEye might have had another bump demographically in Britain, of course, as well with the Bond thing.
Oh, sure.
I mean, I'm sure it's popular internationally, obviously, but I think it had that extra appeal in Britain. It's funny you mentioned before Final Fantasy VII in passing. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit because it's an obvious game to compare Ocarina of Time to in terms of like kind of what the expectations were, what the rivalries were. Another one is Tomb Raider.
Yeah.
But I just want to say, were you, because you mentioned before about having an SNES and having some experience of that when you came to the N64, did that experience of like favorites on the SNES stretch to any of the Zelda games of that period?
No, and it's funny because I hadn't played any Zelda games before Ocarina of Time.
Mm-hmm.
That was my first. So while I know a little bit about the original sort of franchise in the mid '80s, I don't actually have any experience playing them.
That's good because I'm actually on this exactly the same level.
Oh, good.
So yeah. So although I was aware, I think even at the time, but certainly reading up on it since of the sort of NES and SNES iterations of
NES
those,
and
because
SNES.
I
Don't you
know
feel ridiculous just saying that?
I feel ridiculous all the time. What can I say? I'm aware that Ocarina of Time brings a whole lot from, say, A Link to the Past and the previous iterations of it. But for me, I'd actually compare it to something like the new series of Doctor Who in 2005, or the in a different sort of, well, in a similar sort of way, actually, the Marvel Universe films, towards the end of that decade, because both of those are things that I got quite into. Doctor Who a lot, the Marvel Universe more casually. But one of the reasons I'm into those two things is that I enjoyed approaching them with relatively fresh eyes.
Mm.
Because, for instance, like things like DC and Star Trek and things like that, and other game franchises as well, like Mario, for example, is stuff that when a new Mario game came out, I was very, very aware of what it should be and what it, or at least I thought it was before Mario 64 came out. What the tropes were and what the symbolism was and what the sound effects were like and everything like that. And Zelda was very much not that for me. And I think one of the reasons I was so bowled over by Ocarina of Time, I think many people were bowled over by Ocarina of Time for many different reasons,
Yeah.
because it is incredible. But one of the things for me was it was just this new, fresh world. And I was actually thinking as well, the timing of it, because Ocarina of Time came out when I was 13. In fact, we got it, me and my brother got it for Christmas of 98, when I just turned 13 a few months ago. And I was just thinking that that's actually it's like a couple of years before the Lord of the Rings movies came out, for example.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
I wasn't really much of a fantasy person, because I wasn't, because I was into Terry Pratchett's Discworld, which you could argue is more of a sort of satirical deconstruction of fantasy, but it was like seeing the Lord of the Rings movies was like my kind of dose of what traditional high fantasy was actually like. I was sort of catching up a little bit later. I was going, oh, okay, that's where all those tropes come from. That's where Dungeons and Dragons gets its stuff from, and but it's interesting, isn't it, when you think we'll talk about it in more detail, but when you think of like some of the stuff in Ocarina of Time, like a volcanic mountain where sort of rock monsters live, and aquatic worlds as part of that, and you realize there's a bunch of stuff in there, but there's some bits from Tolkien, as there is in everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I know that the castles in Zelda were based off of German castles when they were being designed.
Mm-hmm. You can definitely see that. And I think we'll touch on that again when we talk more about the world map and the kind of area of it. Because one thing I was going to bring up was the obvious thing was theme parks, which sometimes have similar aesthetics. But I think one thing about Ocarina of Time for me was I feel like I should briefly mention Mario 64 because this isn't a sort of in-depth gaming podcast. It's more just about our reactions to it. But Ocarina of Time followed Mario 64 about roughly 2 years after it, and
That's
I think
true. But the game design started at the same time, and at some point, Ocarina of Time was ahead of Mario 64, and then Mario 64 exceeded it and came out a full 2 years earlier.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because you're talking about like game design teams, both headed by Shigeru Miyamoto. So you've got this, who's obviously an absolute video game industry legend, but like he's kind of, I mean, he's still held up, isn't he, as one of like the well, perhaps the kind of I don't know, Orson Welles, would you like to say, also of the video game industry, where his vision has just touched so many things, but like Mario and Zelda are two of the biggest ones, but I think the interesting thing about that parallel development, as you say, is I replayed Mario 64 or bits of it not that long ago, and in Ocarina of Time, you can really see that there are these two quite linked, no pun intended, but kind of symbiotic ways of doing 3D games, and they are drawing not only on the sort of competitors of the time, like things like Tomb Raider that had come out, relatively recently, the PlayStation then, but so that they're kind of bringing Nintendo up to speed, but they're also, the obvious thing with Mario 64, for example, is the movable camera, as opposed to the sort of camera locking that Zelda does, arguably to even greater effect, but like they are different ways of thinking about navigating a 3D space,
Yeah, and I think that some of it was very similar thinking with taking tropes from cinematic camera angles and making it a much fuller experience. I know Miyamoto had this thing where it's like, we have a recommended camera angle, but then there's all these user options of controlling your own experience by changing what that angle is, which I think is such a cool way to think about gaming, and what hugely changed gaming going forward, that opened up these worlds to, there's obviously literally, this linear mode of 2D worlds, but then when you open up the space into a 3D world, then it also opened up more abstractly into this much more complex non-linear format.
And as you say, like maybe one that was more able to easily take on things from film, I mean, one of my favorite touches in Ocarina of Time, as you sort of hint at it, but is when you're in the famous sort of Z targeting combat mode, that the screen narrows, the screen becomes widescreen, and which at the time gaming very much was not, basically, as a standard thing, and it makes it seem more dramatic, doesn't it? Because it's subconsciously you're used to seeing films where things are dramatic in a way that they weren't in games, and it's kind
Absolutely.
of, it's one of those things where you're not quite sure how much it was intended by the designers and how much it's a nice side effect of sort of the focus, but it's kind of it's a lovely touch. I mean, I feel like a proper, if we were like doing a proper sort of gaming in-house kind of podcast about Ocarina of Time, what we'd really focus on is all the gaming innovations, and some of them are worth mentioning. But I'm much more interested in talking about the kind of impact it had on, I guess, on my imagination and kind of on the expansion of that. Because I mean, the N64 for me was, it's the most, hands down the most into video gaming I've ever been. It's the only console that I ever like waited for, waited for it to come out and waited to afford it, and saved up pocket money to help afford it. And I got all the magazines. I used to buy N64 magazine from British newsagents all the time. And I got, I think it's funny, these eras feel eternal when you're young, when you're a kid, but like actually it was probably only like a intensive, I don't know, 2.5, 3 year period of my life when I was really into it. And like a lot of adolescent obsessions, it just faded away overnight practically. It's like it almost went, probably comically for other people, it went from like 1 month when I was still into it, and just like then I was like, yeah, shrug, and N64 what, but it coincides with this period of I mean, everyone likes to think one's youth coincides with these like amazingly innovative periods in music and art and film and, gaming, don't they? But I think you can probably safely say that the mid to late 90s is one of those periods when things, I mean, it's up there with things, if you're going to film parallels, isn't it? Like things like the sound explosion and things like that,
and CGI.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the move to simplify things, the move into 3D. And I know it wasn't all overnight, but the way that almost every big gaming franchise tried to take that leap with varying degrees of success.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's funny because I was reading that a lot of the inspiration for Legend of Zelda and the temples and the open world and the dungeons was based on Miyamoto's childhood, which was exploring dense forests and finding caves and going into the caves and kind of creating these fantasies about being an adventurer in these caves. And, in some ways, it's exactly the thing that pulled every child out of that kind of world. Because kids, weren't exploring the woods anymore. They were sitting in their living rooms and exploring Zelda dungeons.
Yeah, it's an irony of his genius, isn't it? That he
it is an irony of his genius.
Experience of exploring outdoors and put every kid indoors for entire summers.
Yeah.
I think you see some of that very childish kind of exploring nature through. I mean, a lot of stuff is particularly when Link is a child in this. We'll talk about the sort of time space. Sounds a bit.
Oh, sure, like ripping up bushes and throwing them.
Well, yeah, yeah, but also like the kind of do you remember like he has jars that he catches things in, so you can just catch bugs and stuff. And it's
Exactly. Yeah.
obviously that's kind of a Pokemon thing as well, isn't it? Like I mean, it's coming from the same place because I know on the episode that we had Olivia on this, she was talking about the Pokemon franchise, about how the game designer of that kind of had similar rural Japanese memories that he kind of based on insect collecting and things like that. So
That makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
And why it's so broadly applicable to so many people and how people can empathize and
Yeah. Well, I suppose even city kids, because I think Miyamoto was a more of a city kid on holiday in the countryside, and that's partly why it made an impact on him. So everyone can relate. I think it's one thing about Ocarina of Time on this playthrough, because this is the first time I've played. I think so. So I played it and completed it, as much as anyone humanly can, when I originally got in 98, 99. And then I think the only time I've really given it a good go of playing through since then was probably the GameCube sort of remaster of it. And I think that was circa 2009. And I remember it wasn't a complete playthrough because we'll probably touch on this, but I only got as far as the water temple that time, which I think is a very familiar refrain of a lot of people because
yes,
that temple is infuriating. But so this is the first time I played through. As we record, I'm basically on the last temple. I'm on the Spirit Temple, or one of the last temples, because there's a bit of non-linearity. Not too much. There's a little bit of non-linearity to the way you can complete them. So I'm basically, on a surface level at least, about to complete the game, I hope.
right.
And it's been quite a journey. I mean, I remember at the time, because I wasn't really an RPG kid, so I hadn't, in 98, I think I'd played a little bit of Final Fantasy VII. I think I'd borrowed it from a friend, and I'd have probably got like, looking back on it is probably I'd got like a 10th of the way through Final Fantasy VII, like the kind of initial Midgar kind of escape bit, and which at the time felt like a big achievement, because it was also I was discovering in Final Fantasy VII what the traditional idea of an RPG already was by that time, the sort of turn-based combat, that kind of character discovery, multi-person parties and things like that.
Yeah, it's like a cooperative board game in some ways, but with CPU characters.
And it was very cool as well. Like a lot of PlayStation 1 games, Final Fantasy VII was very, for that world at least, was very cool and seemed very modern and very kind of relatively grown up, Yeah, and with obviously in Final Fantasy VII's case specifically, you've got like a whole bunch of kind of tech noir stuff in it, haven't you? And kind of like, Blade Runner-esque, Akira-esque kind of design and all that kind of stuff that I guess they got for a lot from manga, but also from previous RPGs.
And chocobos.
And chocobos, yeah. Of course, you have cuckoos in this, which are the chickens. I don't know if that was a little nod there, but I think that probably goes back to older Zelda games. But I think it was nice for me in picking up Ocarina of Time. As I say, I wasn't a Zelda fan, but I knew the lineage of Zelda. Even at that age, I knew Zelda was one of the big Nintendo things, and I knew it had an RPG element to it. I think Ocarina of Time is an RPG, arguably, but I know a lot of purists wouldn't call it one because it's more of an action adventure. Elements of the emerging 3D platformers, certainly elements of stuff like Mario 64,
Yeah, and it does seem that that's the sort of popular thing for critics to talk about, is that this isn't actually a role-playing game, but it's an action adventure, and one of the first ones to be exploring that sort of 3D environment. But they do have those little elements of role-playing games, like I mentioned earlier, with the being able to respond to a character, and you have the choice to say yes or no. Like, are you going to help me, or do you want the stone from me? And you can be like, nah, not now. And then you can decide to be a little bit snarky, and you can also change your name. You don't have to go through the entire game being called Link. You can change it to whatever you want it to be. You can also change Navi's name. And to me, that's also elements of role-playing game where you can kind of play around and personalize it.
That's funny you should mention Navi, because she's for people who don't know it, she's the fairy who's kind of like a small part of the game playing innovation of Ocarina, who kind of acts as this kind of highlighter for areas that you go into and explore, and kind of also kind of provides the excuse, I guess, for the Z targeting system and things like that.
It also has sort of like golden compass element to it. Demons,
that
every Kokiri, the demons, like every Kokiri has their own fairy.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I mean, the Kokiri. I kind of wanted to speak to you about the Kokiri actually in a minute because they're weird. There's a lot of things in this game that are very weird, but
Yes.
I
Yeah.
remember they are very odd and provide some of the more sort of haunting sort of storyline moments and stuff. But it was. But I've seen this now as a cliche because I googled this. But I was basically not today years old, but I was like 3 weeks today old when I realized that Navi is probably also short for navigation. You know that it's kind of a
I can see
joke.
that, sure.
And I don't, apparently there's loads of people online saying that they, it was only years later that they realized that that was probably what that meant
Could
and
you
stuff
imagine
like
if your sat nav had that voice though?
that. Listen,
Yeah. Hey, listen, turn right.
I must admit, it was amazing at the time and everything, but I am realizing, and I don't remember being frustrated at Navi when I originally played it, but now when I think I was out in the desert, like in like the western deserts of Ocarina of Time, just approaching the Spirit Temple, like literally going through like hurricane, like sandstorms and things like that, like going forward, like in this phenomenally dangerous environment, and Navi was like, "Listen, you should maybe think about going to the desert," and I was like, "Thanks."
I remember finding her very annoying, but later on I'm sure we'll talk more about the music of this game, which I think is so central to it, both in gameplay and in modern popular culture. But Navi's voice is sampled in so many songs. It's such a recognizable sound, especially because part of the game mechanic was for her to say hey and say listen, and she wouldn't speak anymore out loud. You'd have these bubbles pop up, and then you'd have to read what she's
Mm.
saying. So it's this implied like this is what she's saying, but you're not going to hear it out loud, which I think in a lot of games, more recently, more modern games, they'll have a person saying that the entire time. Whereas this will just have those markers of like, hey, and listen, which would become, sort of her catchphrases. But you can hear it in so many different songs that you just like. I was listening on Spotify to a few songs, and I kept hearing it sampled, and so I started building a playlist of all these songs
Oh, wow.
that have Navi sampled, and it's a shocking amount.
Wow. If I can find a YouTube friendly kind of version of that, I might like drop one in the middle of the episode or something, or at the end, just see, if we could get that
Oh, you
in.
definitely should.
Sounds like a fascinating subculture. I tell you what, Kat, let's take a break just for a few minutes, and then when we come back, we'll actually start off by talking about that musical element to the game.
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah, including the ocarina mechanics and stuff, because that's actually fascinating, isn't it? And something that, even though it's in the title, tends to get sort of waylaid a little bit. But yeah, let's just take a few minute break and see you guys in a sec.
Here come to town, come to save the Princess Zelda. Got him poked away, now the children don't play, but they will when Link saves the day. Hallelujah! Now Link, fill up your hearts so you can shoot your sword with power. And when you're feeling all down, the valley will come around, so you'll be brave and not diseased now.
Welcome back. And Kat, as you brought it up, I think talking a bit about the music at the heart of Ocarina of Time is a really great idea, actually. And I think when I say at the heart, I mean, obviously it's in the title. I certainly had no idea what an ocarina was before I picked up.
No, who did?
No one did. It's funny. My brother actually, in one of the more eccentric kind of pre-adolescent hobbies, actually picked up several ocarinas. So we had them like lying around the house in Manchester, like purely based on the game. I don't think I correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I don't think you ever got very far with them in terms of proficiency. But they were, in our house for the reason of this game. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the gameplay is augmented by use of the instrument in Zelda, and it's from a fairly early stage. As child Link, you pick it up, and it's got sort of pleasure, a mimetic pleasure to itself, isn't it? Because it's fun to sort of learn and copy things, but it's also it's essentially a series of magic spells, isn't it? To manipulate the world around you.
And I didn't try and look too deeply into this, but do you know if all of those keys, the arrows and the A button, if they always play the same note?
They do. Yeah, and they modulate, but you can modulate it not in a way that is useful in the game, but you can bend the notes using the analog stick and things like that.
Right, right,
which
right.
is so you can basically play quite a lot on it if you really. In fact, there's probably sort of you talk about YouTube subcultures and stuff. There's probably a subculture of people who play all kind of like Metallica songs on the
Oh,
ocarina
I'm
and things like
sure.
that.
Yeah. Well, it's like, originally phone tones were specifically used to, hit certain reeds in order to convey information of numbers. And those tones have changed now because people could listen and be able to tell what number somebody was dialing, and it was like a privacy issue and all of that. But there's still some phones that will make those sounds. It doesn't do anything anymore functionally, but you can, play all sorts of things if you want. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I'm just fascinated by the fact that it's only a handful of notes in a couple of different orders that make such different songs that to
Mhm.
this day, if you hum it, will get stuck in most gamers, heads, or any kid who picked up an N64, in the 90s.
Oh, they're amazing. I mean, yeah, things like the sort of is it the main cockery? Is it Saria's song, which is that it's the
Yeah.
famous sort of. I mean, that just will stick with you for weeks.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think it's like the first 3 or 4 songs that you learn that end up being the most popular. And maybe, I'm somebody who can freely admit that I never finished the game. I watched my sister
Mhm.
finish it, but I never made it to the Spirit Temple.
Mhm.
But all of the songs that you learn after a certain time, you don't really hear that much in the samplings or in the sort of chill hop or study and chill sort of playlists that you get of the lo-fi hip hop, that they always sample Saria's song, Zelda's Lullaby, probably the Song of Time. But you don't really tend to hear the Minuet of the Forest.
Yeah, I really like the site-specific ones. Like the Bolero of Fire and
Nocturne of Shadow.
yeah, I mean the ones that are basically like site-specific warp tunes. Essentially,
Yeah.
It's actually a really nice way, isn't it? Like in an older, more linear style of gameplay, you're essentially just what you're doing with a lot of those is replicating things that would have been passcodes, like in the early 90s. Things
sure,
like
yeah.
essentially skip to level 30. And that's basically what you're doing.
Well, it's like phone numbers.
Yeah, that's it. Well, it's funny when you said ringtones. I was thinking like the late 90s and early 90s were that sort of era of programmable ringtones. When
That's
it was actually
true.
it was a novelty. I remember these. They'd sell these like books. Like that were little manuals of all these like tunes that you could program into your like old Nokias and stuff like that. This has something in common with that.
Yeah, and I think the 90s were a lot about customization, especially as far as technology goes.
I feel like I'm probably saying this because the N64 is kind of my era, so to speak. But I think there's something about the innovation of the N64 which is really nice, I think, which is that most great N64 games, and there are a lot of great games from that era, they're sort of teaching you how to play the N64, the game in question, and navigate the world that is often required quite a bit of innovation to even come up with. But they're also sort of teaching you how to use the pad fully.
Yeah.
Like, and Zelda's a great example of that because, everything from the ocarina being essentially a sort of a way to explore the pad and its different uses to obviously the wonder that is the analog stick and things like that, but to the way they use the C buttons in Ocarina of Time, for example. So you've got this kind of inventory, quite varied inventory that would be familiar to anyone who'd played Resident Evil games and stuff like that. But it's just such a nice, flexible and accessible way to customize what you're carrying and sort of and what you can use on the spot.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most exciting things about Ocarina of Time was just the mix of forms of gameplay. You can run around and be attacked by things and just do some hacky slashy stuff, but then you also have all these puzzles that have so much to do with spatial awareness and these sort of thinking elements to it. And I found out that apparently these games that involve sort of dancing or music in response to something, or learning a dance or learning music in order to solve puzzles or to trigger some kind of a function, are called rhythm action games. And something like Dance Dance Revolution is entirely rhythm action throughout the entire, that is the game. But what's cool about Ocarina of Time is that it uses rhythm action in terms of the ocarina itself. Plus, there's the action adventure parts of it. Plus, there's little bits of role playing, and there's also the sort of spatial puzzle games, the sort of Tetris in 3D kind of situations that you get into that make it complex in such a great way. And I know that apparently originally Miyamoto was like worried about the complexity and the thinking element of it being a turnoff for the game, and I'm sure for some people it is, but I loved it. Like that's what attracted me to it and kept me playing it.
Oh, definitely, and it was a very accessible game as well as being such an innovative game, and as you say, one with like wide demographic appeal as well. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, I think you could say, you know, in a slightly different way, you could sort of say the same thing about Final Fantasy VII and a bunch of people who came of age playing that as well. I mean, one thing it's funny you talk about the repetitive hack and slash nature of some of the environments and stuff. I think one of the wonderful things about replaying it on this time is I've realized that it's very, very carefully modulated so that any of those repetitive aspects that you get through sort of exploration games, the moment you start finding them tiresome, the game finds a way to level you up so that you don't. I mean, so that you can still do them, but you don't have to. So I'm thinking if you just take Hyrule Field, because I want to talk about the geography of Ocarina of Time in a minute, but if you just take Hyrule Field, for example, one might weary a little bit of crossing it, getting attacked by skeleton warriors, you know,
Sure.
just the space, you know, I mean, the expanse of it at the time was something that's stunning, but it can be a bit trudgy, you know, if you're trying to make your way from one side to another. At almost exactly the point where an average player would get a bit sick of it, you get the horse. And then at exactly the time when you might get a little bit sick, even of using the horse to traverse it, you start getting the warp tunes essentially on the ocarina to a real extent, so that you know you can be as immersed as you like in it. But if you don't want to play it like that, you don't have to. And it's kind of, I think there's this really, and this must have all been very well thought out, you know. But
I'm sure, and game tested, and you know the game plays as though there was feedback, and you can kind of hear the feedback as you're playing the game for exactly those same elements. And the idea of the fairy fountains and being able to pick up new magical powers, or you know, picking up the spin attack and learning these new ways to engage in the world definitely keeps it really fresh.
No, it definitely does. I mean, you know, let's move on to talk about the geography of the world now, because I basically have two like overarching things that I want to talk to you about remaining. Obviously, we can throw in some other ideas in the process, but one is the geography and one is the time stuff, you know, and I think it's because they both pull in a bunch of interesting stuff that certainly occurred to me on this playthrough, if not when I was a kid. So the geography of it, I was, you know, I sent you to refresh your memory before we talked about this, and I sent you like the sort of map of the Ocarina of Time world. It's quite iconic in its own right.
You did, yes.
But I was thinking, especially because I've been playing Mario 64 recently, and Mario 64 kind of popularized and sort of codified the idea of a 3D hub world, didn't it? You know, a hub world to access the other things, and that, you know, in Mario 64 famously they used a castle, and the sort of levels traditionally are you know, you jump through these magical portraits and you're in a sub world essentially, you know, and this is kind of how things started to be done, you know, in sort of games.
That just made me so nostalgic.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Well, you know, don't get me starting about talking about Banjo-Kazooie or anything like that. You know, we'll be here all night. But you know, it became very much the way things were done. But already 2 years later, and as you say, in the parallel development process, Ocarina of Time does things a little bit differently, and you've got something akin to a more geographically realistic world. Where you've got, I mean, the structure of it really is that you've got a castle, but
certainly more realistic than jumping through paintings in a castle.
Yeah, I mean, less completely untethered
being ground
from, you know,
zero.
Yeah, from a physical reality. You know, you've got basically like a proper fantastical kingdom, you know, like in a way that like the Mushroom Kingdom very rarely was, for example. You know, I mean, obviously you've got games like Paper Mario, you know, which, you know, have tried to flesh it out into something akin to more of not a real, but, you know, a sort of cogent fantasy world. But the Hyrule of Ocarina of Time, and obviously this is my introduction to this, there's something again wonderful about the fusion of the sort of basic mythology of the Zelda games with the way in which you're going to play this game and access this game, isn't it? Like, you know, so Link starts out as a child in the Kokiri Forest, which is kind of off to the east of the map, and it's kind of, I mean, as I say, like bringing in Tolkien stuff, it's essentially the Shire of this game, isn't it? You know,
absolutely, yeah.
You know, with a little bit of sort of Peter Pan eeriness thrown in because you know, they don't grow up.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that detail, and I don't know why. I mean, it's kind of an important detail, especially because, you know, you find out, spoiler alert, that Link isn't actually a Kokiri because he can grow up.
Yeah, which is
but
weird.
It does beg the question, where do they come from?
Well, I mean, it begs that question, and it also, when I was a kid, I'd forgotten that detail, and I was just like, well, Link grows up because he's transported into the future, right? But they have this sort of weird, you know, but that happens instantaneously when you pull out the Master Sword. So it actually has this implication that he's kind of been in a weird suspended animation, you know, that he's kind of been growing over 7 years or whatever it is, you know, in some sort of tube or something.
Yeah,
you know,
they actually say when you wake up in the sort of chamber of sages, the mustachioed man tells him that he's been in suspended animation in that zone, letting him grow up so that he can be a hero. Because before he was just a child.
Which is just one of many, many very creepy things in Ocarina of Time, I say.
That's a bit weird that they're like, don't do anything for 7 years and you'll be a hero now. But maybe you should have spent that 7 years gaining heroic experiences.
Yeah, you're quite right. We'll get back onto this when we talk more about the chronology and the way it uses time travel in the game. But in terms of the world map, I was thinking when I was looking just at that map that I sent you, the obvious thing in my head to compare it to was a theme park, a sort of post-Disneyland theme park, because obviously you've got that castle, relative at the center of it, and you've got a hub world, and you've got the themed worlds off to the side of it. Like I was a big, Disneyland sort of fanatic when I was a kid, learning about all these themed worlds you could go to and explore. That's part of it. But one thing I realized that, although superficially that's certainly in the makeup of that kind of geographical layout, I was actually thinking as an adult, what is the nearest to this experience that I would have? And I was actually thinking that it's much closer, if you really think about it, to a music festival, because music festivals you have, and I was actually thinking in scope as well. If you think of it as a genuinely realistic scope, the Ocarina of Time world, it's about that the time it takes you to walk from one side of the world to another is about the time it would take you to walk across a moderately sized music festival, and you have that same big field as the hub essentially, and the attractions off to the side and stuff.
I think that's about right. I mean, I've just pulled up the map now, so I'm looking at it, and I think your Disneyland comparison is pretty spot on. You could definitely, somebody could be like, oh, have you seen the map of the new Zelda theme park? And they could show me this map and I'd be like, wow, yeah, I see how that works.
Yes, it's a feasible size for either a theme park or a large theme park or a moderately sized music festival, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to see what maps of early Disneyland looked like, though, because I don't really know what informs what as far as, I don't know that Disneyland might have changed the way their maps are or the way they're setting their parks up to be more like a video game world.
That's really interesting, isn't it? How the kind of, I suppose, like 50s, 60s kind of theme park experience is kind of later brought into the home through home consoles and home computing, and then and those environments can inform each other. It might be Tokyo Disney, but a theme park that's opening a sort of Mario themed world. I think later this year.
That's fun,
and it's so interesting to see like video game landscapes, especially such iconic ones, replicated in real like blocky colors and sort of like big sculptures and stuff. It's really interesting. But yeah, I mean, all these forms of kind of play initially for children or initially aimed at children that have become more and more kind of adult provinces. That's a very 20th, like late 20th century, early 21st century thing, isn't it? It's kind of a very iconic thing about our age,
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, of course, some of it's, informed by natural geography. You have a river running into a lake, for example, or a volcano on a mountain also. But, I think with somewhere like Disneyland, it started out with a certain amount of space. And obviously, the only way to add on is to kind of go outward, and often in a sort of cyclical way. You're kind of going out in a circle so that you're expanding evenly on each side. When you come up with a new world, it ends up here. And if you do another one, then it's going to be maybe on the opposite side and sort of branching away from this central point rather than creating some kind of archipelago or it just continues. I guess it probably depends on what kind of land is available around it, but Disney has so much money now; they could probably buy anyone out of whatever they have.
Yeah, well, yeah, too right. Certainly, that's true now. If it wasn't before.
Oh, you say there's a freeway there? Well, it's the Disney way now.
Yeah, no, that's probably close to the truth. I think there's an awareness in the same way I was saying like Nintendo Nintendo are one of the ultimate, I think, hawks of pop culture in the sense they can just take even into their own iconic franchises, especially into their own iconic franchises. They take aesthetics and symbolism and elements from all kinds of popular culture franchises and traditions. And because Zelda builds on previous Nintendo games and gaming adventures and RPGs, but it also, there's tons of European and Arabian and Japanese myth in there, isn't there? Tons
absolutely.
of like cool imagery.
And through some research for the Anime Movie Podcast, I found out that a lot of the European influence in storytelling that came to Japan was during the Romantic period. So, which is heavily influenced by Catholicism. So there's a lot of weird sort of artifacts of that in Japanese storytelling when European myths and legends kind of come into it, which includes why so many of them have vampirism,
Right.
which is really, really popular in Japanese stories. And that's all to do with the Catholic idea of a vampire.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even if you look at like Link as a sort of central protagonist, I mean, his look is kind of like a big jumble of, you might say, I already mentioned Peter Pan, which is sort of thematically appropriate, but there's a bunch of like Robin Hood, William Tell, he looks like if you put a bunch of European mythological figures in a sort of blender, and you kind of you get roughly that, you'd get that kind of that kind of outfit, that kind of style.
And also the elf thing and the pointed ears and all of that.
Yeah, that's the bit that makes it feel quite. I mean, that's almost like they've blended the elves and the sort of hobbits. If you're going to go Tolkien with it, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've kind of got elements of both of them in terms of the setup. I mean, I think that geographical diversity is obviously appealing, and in the same way that like Pokemon, the sort of fauna that you encounter varies from where you go, but also it allows you to draw on that sort of fantasy shorthand, doesn't it? Of I mean, like gaming environments, sort of in this sort of nascent 3D gaming world, if you go up a mountain, you know what kind of area you're going to approach. As you're saying, volcanic, you are tailored enough in video games by this point where you know that might have certain things that are to do with heat and the channeling of heat, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of thought about this and probably writing, but there tends to be these elements that come into gameplay that have to do with, I mean, it's that kind of Captain Planet kind of idea where there's heart, air, water. What else is there?
Yes.
Yes, all of those. Fire, earth. So all of these elements kind of, get sort of objectified into, fetch quest items or things that you need in order to piece together something to get to sort of the next level of the game. And in Magic the Gathering, which came out in 1993, you have sort of a mana pool. Mana is the sort of magic power you're able to use and draw from. And the elements in that are sort of fire and that sort of nebulous idea of shadow. And then there's planes, which is also to do with sort of light, and it's the sort of field. And then you get the water, which is represented by islands. And then you get the green, which is represented by forest land. And, those are really the same kind of elements that are brought into this game, and that the sort of stones and gems are sort of based off of this different, and the sages that you collect. They're based off of those ideas: the water, the forest, the field, the sort of spirit and light, and the sort of darkness and shadow. But that sort of fire and rock earth thing that, oh God, how am I blanking on their names? The rock people.
Oh, the Gorons.
The Gorons.
Yeah. And the what's it? The Zoras, is it?
Zoras for the water. Yeah.
The aquatic people, yeah. I mean, I think most kids, well, I would say most kids are like this, but I certainly was a keen collector, and I think a lot of kids' instincts go towards collecting and assembling things, don't they? And kind of learning the elemental stuff might be, most kids who are kind of curious, like finding out all the elements that kind of go into making up a unity of something, don't they? Like, I was thinking,
it's very structuralist, structural functionalist.
Yeah, no, I think I was that kind of kid actually, but I'm sure a lot of people are as well. But I'm a bit of a hoarder as well, and I like to dignify it, But it's funny with the Triforce itself, isn't it? You've got symbolically the three parts of the Triforce are to do with what makes up Link, or what ideally would make up a hero, right? Is it
power, wisdom, and courage?
Yeah, which is kind of interesting, because as far as I remember, I haven't got to the climax of the game yet, but I think they kind of end up almost kind of light touch personifying Ganondorf, Zelda, and Link as the three corners of that, or like,
I can see that
being fitted to those corners, and that's kind of a cliche of most popular myth, isn't it? That courage is it's the sort of thing that allows the little guy to triumph. It's the kind of the sort of he might not be the cleverest person, or it's usually a he. Let's face it.
Yeah.
He might not be the cleverest person or the strongest person, but he will somehow endure, or there'll be some sort of like quirk of bravery, or kind of and that'll get him through. You know?
Or luck.
Well, and luck. I mean,
Deus Ex Machina.
If it's a quad force with luck, then that would definitely be my corner. You know.
Yeah, I mean, the hero's usually lacking in the beginning in some way. The sort of outcast character or weak, or in this case, the boy without a fairy.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought that sort of Northern Lights Dark Materials link into it, because that it is a bit like that. And actually, I don't know if that can be conscious, because I think the first His Dark Materials book came out about it might have come out a couple of years before this, maybe, but certainly when it was in development, hadn't really permeated into British culture very much, I think, at the time. But I mean, it's so iconic now, isn't it? And the idea of these like tethered beings, is quite resonant. I'd like to get into talking about more the temporal kind of nature of the plot a little bit, if that's all right, because
sure.
I certainly, I mean, I always found it so I guess as a starter, right, I'm now a 35-year-old man, on paper, so like the idea of like going back and playing something that I was fully immersed in as a 13-14-year-old obviously had a nice little parallel there in a sort of replay of the Ocarina of Time, in the sense that you are shifting between, after roughly a third of gameplay, you're then shifting between these two landscapes. And one I think the thing I might mention to you before we even started thinking about recording this properly was one of the most melancholy bits in Ocarina of Time is when you realize what you're sort of shifting into the future third way through the game has done to sort of Link's sort of nascent life, in a sense, because they don't really soft foot around the fact that like you've essentially ruined his life. You meet Saria. I think this is still such a heartbreaking moment. When I think it's when she's revealed as like this sort of forest sage. You've got through the forest temple, and she just the game emphasizes and cruelly emphasizes that she had a soft spot for you and you had a soft spot for her, but she's a kid forever and you're exiled from that life. And I guess the implication with Link's non-Kokiri nature is that this always would have happened, but the way it has happened is basically through this massive sudden trauma, and you both just have to live with that, and it's kind of
that is really tragic. I mean, and it also emphasizes the fact that she can't be there for him after she realizes she's a sage, because she's hangs out in the chamber of sages, and she says like, I'll always be a friend to you, but like I can't be there, we can't be together even in like a friendship sense. And I found that very sad, and I was trying to think of what the sages do in the chamber of sages in between cutscenes.
Mahjong.
Yeah. Right.
It's endless Mahjong tournaments.
When you become a sage, do you just not care about being bored anymore and you can just meditate for hours? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Ideally, I mean, I think most heroic myths have someone at least, and again, if we're talking about a male kind of figure at the heart of these, a lot of them have them going from boy to man, don't they? If not literally, then at least going from, I think of like Luke Skywalker for an easy example, like going from the kind of relative backwater and kind of very, very quickly maturing into like a pretty proficient resistance fighter / wizard, essentially.
Yeah.
In a very unrealistic timescale. What a Mary Sue, you might say. But I think the interesting thing about Link is the whole game is just laced with such melancholy about what that actually means. Like about taking someone with something akin to a normal life, at least in the community that they've grown up in, and turning them into this extraordinary heroic figure. And they'd really, apart from, I think Navi might be partly in there to make the whole thing seem less bleak, because at least you've got a companion. Because the rest of it's just kind of, there's so much transactional stuff in Zelda and obviously most RPGs, but so you interact with people a lot, but you don't really carry anyone along with you, do you? I mean, I think in a sense the fairy and the horse soften that blow a little bit,
I think that's true. I think, the biggest thing about Epona for me was, again, that sort of anxiety that comes with what happens in the in-between, which I always felt bad leaving Epona in random places.
I know what you mean. I've been having that too. Yeah.
I felt really weird about that. And so I try to like leave her by water or something. Leave her by a plant. Be like, you can munch on this, right?
That's so sweet. I mean,
and I think that's something, that really shows how much the game does make you feel and how it puts you in this world. And I think that you can even empathize it with it today, even though the graphics are laughable compared to some graphics now, but at the time it was mind-blowing.
Oh, very good. And like even coped with like known weaknesses of the 64 at the time. It was like, do you remember like the famous like pop-up thing that happened on the 64 a lot, where like buildings would just come into existence like 30 meters away from you or whatever, and Zelda's both very good at not doing that, but also at disguising where it necessarily would happen. Like, the sort of slow undulations of Hyrule Field, where it kind of, it'll basically have you walk up the hill to the point where the building would have to pop up, but it's revealed more organically, and it's kind of things like that, just so clever, like dealing with it as every generation of games and films indeed does. They have to deal with the technical limitations of the time, but this just does it so elegantly that you barely think about it, and that deepens the immersion.
And I think watching the cutscenes this time around made me realize the sort of little actions that the characters make, which is things like looking like they're breathing when they're just standing there, which a 2D games just didn't have that. You didn't have characters fidget. They were either moving or not moving. But I feel like Ocarina of Time was one of the first ones where you could kind of see the sort of subtle movements of what happens when somebody's not really doing anything. There's still so much going on, and I really liked that. And now characters, if you leave them somewhere, they'll like stretch and they'll like do random things, which I think is very important for making it feel more lived in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, there's the thing you were saying about Epona before, about the sort of feeling guilty for leaving places and things like that. There's an absolutely wonderful moment that I don't know if you would have experienced or you might have seen secondhand through Tinny playing it, but like when you're, especially when you're approaching the Spirit Temple and you're starting to move out into the Western Desert, you're very conditioned in Ocarina, aren't you, to like think of like most like ledges, most surfaces Epona can't go off, so that's like a sort of safety thing, but also like at the entrances to most zones, most like parts of the off-field world, she can't go. But there's a great bit in that where the bridge is out, you see that the bridge is out and you charge with Epona towards it, just expecting that you'll stop, and actually she jumps it. And like, it cuts at the very brief cutscene, she just jumps it spectacularly against like the sunrise, and it's kind of like
this. Yeah.
And it's like, and it's unexpected. There's no flagging that that's going to happen, and it's like suddenly you can take this horse like into this expanse that you just thought you were going to have to get off and walk essentially, and it's so great, because it turns this imposing barrier into like this new ability. It's fantastic.
Yeah, we haven't talked anything about like Breath of the Wild or any of the more recent games, but I think that one thing that's made it really difficult for me to try to get very far into Breath of the Wild that are elements that Twilight Princess don't have, that Ocarina of Time don't have, is this idea of sort of weapons breaking down or having to find ingredients and find a fire and cook things. And it kind of makes me think that they were trying to do some of the same things that Ocarina of Time did for gaming, where there's these little complexities that you didn't have before. And they're trying to be like, oh, well, they, gamers accepted these complexities with very open arms, and it was incredibly well received. But I think that today's games go too far with it, that I found it really tedious to like have weapons break and have to go find another weapon because it's, wearing and tearing. And I'm like, I know, like my daily life is about having to find things to cook and eat and worrying about things breaking or not being useful anymore. But Ocarina of Time just had that really beautiful sweet spot of exactly the right amount of thinking, the exact right amount of action and
preparedness
magic
and stuff.
And having to have some preparedness and having the responsibility of collecting heart containers, which you can avoid and not get, but it's better to get them. I just think that some of today's games are so open that it's almost impossible for me to imagine to play without having to consult walkthroughs. But a game like Ocarina of Time, where I think there's no shame in consulting a walkthrough.
I've had to do it a few times. I'll tell you that.
But there's a lot of clues. The game is so good at telling you what you need to do, at every stage, and it really guides you through it, but also gives you the freedom to be able to make slightly different choices. And I just think that balance is so good.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I suppose out with the size of this conversation really, but I suppose like Breath of the Wild, in the same way that Ocarina of Time was to an extent necessarily playing catch up with things like Final Fantasy VII and Tomb Raider, especially in the dungeon mechanics. Breath of the Wild is playing catch up with things like Skyrim, that happened earlier in the decade, and, things that moved on RPGs for people, and those kind of games. But anyway, I don't know too much about that, so I'm going to stay clear of it. But
sure.
I wanted to say, actually, it's funny you mentioned walkthroughs, right? Because I wanted to talk to you about something about the temporal mechanics of the game that only came up because I had to consult a walkthrough for something.
Okay.
So there's a wonderful bit which I'd completely forgotten about. And this is partly why I had to consult the FAQs. Was as adult Link, you go to is it Kakariko Village,
Yeah.
Karakiro Village, however you say that, and there's the windmill there, and you end up consulting the dude in there who's playing music on his sort of accordion thing, and he teaches you, adult Link, a song that magically breaks the windmill. Essentially, he teaches you that because he's so annoyed by it, he still remembers it when it happened 7 years ago. You learn that as adult Link. You go back to become Child Link again. You play the song to him, which is how he knows it, and break the windmill as a kid.
Right.
And he remembers it and teaches you. So it's a perfect paradox. It's the tuners essentially come from nowhere in the best way that sci-fi paradoxes do. It's a lovely moment, and what it reminded me of instantly was the Terminator film series. Because that's one of the biggest pop culture illustrations of that kind of paradox. Where in Terminator, Kyle Reese goes back in time, and in trying to sort of preserve John Connor's mother, he actually ends up being the father of John Connor. And it's one of the more popular examples of that. And I was actually thinking, I told you I had kind of like a crazy Terminator theory too.
You did. Yeah, I was mentally prepared for this.
Oh, good. Well, it's not so much a theory, it's more just like a sort of very pretentious sort of interpretation
It's a
of
thing
Ocarina
I thought
of Time,
of over tea.
Yeah, but I suppose because it's basically pertaining to the first two Terminator films, and they came out in the mid '80s and the early '90s respectively. So they were in the air when this game was made,
Sure,
and things like that.
contemporaneous.
Yeah, totally. And it was just that the more I thought about it, I was thinking like, well, this has some weird echoes of Terminator, because you've got that kind of mix between a child sort of chosen one forced to grow up too fast and knowing that they will have this role in saving the world, and also the kind of adult, almost like child in a man's body kind of inexperienced guy who's having to like go through this terrible like post-apocalyptic kind of haunted world. Actually, it was reinforced by do you remember as adult Link, you're walking through like the once populated like Hyrule Castle town square,
Yeah.
and actually it's just this horrific like nightmarescape populated by zombies shambling around, and it's all ashen, and there's like dust cloud and everything. I was like, this is very like the sort of Skynet future that you glimpse there. But I was just thinking that in a sense, what that does then in the person of Link is it sort of takes the archetypes of like Kyle Reese as the sort of future warrior and John Connor, the sort of boy chosen one, and sort of blends them into one body in a sense, like it uses the temporal mechanics to kind of, and actually I think in a similar way, because I mean, when I did my film course at St Andrews, which Kat will know a little bit about, we studied the Terminator on one of our modules, and they literally it was partly because Terminator is freighted with this, examination of masculinity and kind of, what it means to be everything from a sort of ultra masculine, impossible robot to, a fragile boy who has to grow up fast to these like sort of these denizens of a sort of nightmare future world who are trying to be, good men, that kind of thing. And I just thought like, in a more low key way, in a more suitable for children way, Ocarina of Time's kind of playing in some of the same areas there, isn't it?
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, it's kind of like Terminator meets Super Mario Brothers meets Tolkien.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I think,
so there's a lot going on there.
And actually, Tolkien, many themes going on in Tolkien, obviously, but a lot of that is tinged with melancholy as well, isn't it? Like a lot of Tolkien
absolutely.
is kind of about the impossibility of really going home. Certainly for a lot of people, or certainly for the people at the heart of chosen one narratives. That's kind of the whole melancholy at the end of Frodo's journey, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I presented a question to you not too long ago when we were messaging about this, and I said, "What's the difference between Bowser and Ganondorf?"
Yeah,
I think you said his clothes or something.
I was very facetious, yeah. But what were you getting at with that? Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think I was just drawing a parallel to the idea that you have this evil, monstrous character who's kind of in a position of royalty that was unjustly usurped, and they steal a good princess, and then a man has to go try and save the princess who can bring the world sort of back to peace and some sense of normalcy. And so I was like, I guess there's something more interesting there if you dive a little bit deeper and really think about what the difference is between sort of Bowser and Ganondorf's I don't know, ideals, motivations. I guess I just think that when people sat down, when there was a round table discussion about how evil people should be designed, that people were just like, what's the worst thing you can do? What's just the worst? And somebody was like, take over the world.
Well, and steal the woman, basically.
And steal a woman, yeah.
Steal the sacred woman at the heart of the nation. You know, that's
Yeah,
kind
and
of,
either rule the world or destroy the world. Those are sort of the motivations. But I don't know that Bowser knows that he has any other options.
You know, we should try and negotiate with him.
Yeah, I don't think he has any other game plan or ever knew. Like with Ganondorf, you kind of get the idea that he has a backstory and that at some point he decided that he wanted power and he wanted recognition. He's the sort of person you imagine would get really angry if he didn't have enough likes on an Instagram post. But I don't think Bowser is concerned with social media or the way anyone views him.
There's a wonderful thing on the latest Paper Mario game. Is it the Origami Kingdom on the Switch, where they actually really sweetly emphasize Bowser's nature as a single father. Because like in most versions of it, he's basically trying to keep this sort of Koopa clan together and stuff like that. And he's like chasing around after baby Bowser trying to like save him. And he's like basically he stops to talk to Mario. And he's like, I know I'm pretty mean, but wouldn't you be if you had to like raise this entire family on your own? Like, and I was just like, whoa, this just got really real, and I kind of love it. Like,
that's amazing.
I'm so glad you brought up Ganondorf, actually, because I had two things I wanted to say about Ganondorf, and both come from the kind of one comes from initial sort of reminiscence about the game, and one comes from just the play I was having today. But one is that he's presented as a Gerudo thief who's from the Western deserts, and specifically from the deserts, and he's this outsider who is not to be trusted and everything. And I was saying to you, wasn't I, in a message weeks ago, that that's sort of like on the surface that's just like classic Orientalism. It's like,
I was gonna say, yeah, it is an Orientalism thing, but interestingly also anti-ginger.
Yes, he is very redheaded.
He's just elements of anti-ginger and Orientalism. It's very hard for me to say.
I thought the interesting thing about him actually is, because he's actually Occidental. He's from the west of the kingdom, and I thought that the interesting thing about that, if you compare it to other sort of popular mythos, is I was looking around for a parallel, and I realized that actually it's quite primal in terms of American fantasy fiction because it's Oz.
That's true.
Because the villain comes off from the the Wicked Witch of the West actually lives. If you look at Oz maps, it's a very basic world map compared to some of them, but she's in the wilderness to the west of the sort of quote unquote civilized parts of Oz, and
sure.
It's kind of mirroring. This is what I mean about like Miyamoto putting like just a bunch of stuff in the mix, and it's almost like
absolutely,
it's all blended up there. But the other thing I had to say about Ganondorf was based on the gameplay I was just having, where I don't know if you remember, but when you go out to the west, you come upon the sort of Gerudo fortress, and you find out that they're essentially all, apart from Ganondorf, they're all women. And there's kind of you've got that Amazonian thing kind of blended in there as well, and they're this sort of proud warrior race. Do you remember you end up like sneaking around the temple and like having to like free prisoners and things like that, but you earn their grudging respect. And they actually say, one of them, I think it's in the Spirit Temple, one of them says, oh well, actually our people, we're all female, but one man is born every 100 years and he becomes our king. But the actual this woman doesn't want to be ruled by Ganondorf. She thinks he's unworthy of it. She thinks he's evil, and so she's stuck between her constitution and her choices. But what it made me think, apart from the sort of almost like pornographic idea of like one man being born every, to dozens and dozens of women every generation, is it's really interesting that kind of part of this exploration of masculinity is you get glimpses of this other, like Ganondorf and Link almost have these parallels where the glimpses you get of Ganondorf's life, fantastical and unrealistic though it is kind of a parallel to Link, where they're both kind of alone, and they're both like, you get the feeling they both must have this stuff to prove. And I know this is ridiculously overanalyzing kind of a child-friendly text, but I think it's an interesting little hint at something there, Well,
I think if they ever did manage to make a cinematic version of this for the big screen, that those are the sort of themes that they would explore a bit more deeply, in order to make it a really well-rounded story. Yeah, I think that the Gerudos are kind of like Aladdin meets the Amazons. Amazonian Aladdin.
Yes.
Because you have the sort of Prince of Thieves and all those sorts of Arabian ideas. But then you also have this, all women. But it seems like Miyamoto has this trope of just screwing with the demographics. It's like the Kokiri are all children. And the Gerudos are all women.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that is a simple tweak you can make, I guess.
And I'm not going to think very much about how people reproduce.
Well, you know what? That is such a good note, because I think what will probably be the final phase of this podcast is I kind of want to talk to you. This is partly kind of biographical on my part, but also like I think probably plays into a lot of people's wider perceptions of the game and maybe some of the thematics as well. But because this is a game about like centrally about really sort of navigating between childhood and adulthood. I remember at the time, because in a time when Sony in particular were making games maybe like you might say sexier, and obviously
Sure.
barely even touched on Lara Croft, but like she was the first sort of sex symbol game character, and like that sort of stuff. Ocarina of Time doesn't do exactly the same thing, but I think it's got actually ultimately a more mature and slightly troubling. I mean, like I think it's ultimately fairly wholesome, but like kind of like an interesting take on that sort of stuff. Because do you remember there's things like the fairies in the fountains that you meet?
I was going to talk about the hypersexualization of the fairies, of the fairy fountains.
Well, do you remember like the camera pans over their bodies like deliberately?
Oh yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's really weird because you first encounter them. I think most game players first encounter them when you're child Link too. And he looks as baffled and confused and scared as you'd expect a child in that position to be. And they're quite for Nintendo in that era. They're quite sexy as well. They're quite. They're obviously.
And they're thick.
Ones...
They're.
Yeah. They sure are. And barely dressed. As
yeah.
Well,
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking this time watching the cutscenes about how difficult it would be if you wanted to cosplay as a fairy of the Great Fairy Fountain to not look like Poison Ivy. Because
you need a lot of special tape and stuff.
Well, because their skin is greenish, and then they're kind of they kind of have vines barely covering everything that needs to be covered, and then they have this bright red hair and tall boots. Yeah. But I think in most circles, people would go, "Oh, Poison Ivy."
And I think they've got that eerie laugh thing going on. They're always eerily laughing as well, which is
their scream laugh.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And I think maybe particularly for boys and men playing it, it's quite unnerving. Because they say like the most unnerving thing as a male person is for women to laugh at you, essentially, for a lot of people. But what I was thinking is I suppose one is a biographical point I was going to come on to, but the basic point I was trying to make about that was as child Link, you are confronted with these slightly unnerving hints of adult sexuality. And then as adult Link, you are confronted with kind of the opposite, which is this sort of awareness that the innocent love and friendship of youth is gone.
Yeah.
And there's like, with Saria, we already talked about, and there's an interesting blending where obviously because you keep moving back and forth between those worlds, that keeps overlapping. And, it mostly comes out in a sort of heteronormative way because it's Nintendo, but like you meet girls, don't you? You meet a couple of girls of different species, actually, who you then meet as adults, and they evoke complicated feelings in the player then playing as an adult, and they are then adult women, and they have feelings about Link, and it's kind of, it's interesting, there's a complicated thing going on there that adds to the melancholy and has a sort of, I'd say kind of like quite a complicated sexual prism that's in a way beyond just titillation or beyond that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you kind of see that in the reveal of Sheik as being Princess Zelda, and Princess Zelda now wears lipstick, and she shows her hair.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But and one thing we never really touched on was talking about the Sheikah, or about Sheik or Impa, who are interesting female characters. I like the idea of the sort of royal family of Hyrule having these guards who are, again, kind of Amazonian, the sort of female warriors. At least that's the idea that I got, that like I kind of felt like all the Sheikah are women and there are these warrior women, which is such a cool, like I'd go and watch a movie about just the Sheikah. Like that sounds awesome.
Most of the badass characters you meet in the game are female, I would say.
That's true. It is very like female heavy.
A good proportion.
But then I don't know why everyone thought Sheik was a man.
I suppose it's the sort of old, kind of bias in favor of male identity, isn't it? Where, neutrality is seen as male,
Sure.
that sort of disguise.
Yeah, I mean, and Impa, when she's introduced as the first Sheikah, she's probably the second most sexualized character after all of the fairies of the fairy fountains.
She's a very attractive woman.
She's
by Nintendo standards. Yeah. She's a very fine woman. And again, you meet her as child Link,
Yeah, and because you have those low angles, you're just looking at the massive grapefruits on her chest that are just barely covered with little bits of metal.
Yeah. it's the sort of thing that could definitely evoke like sexual or proto-sexual feelings in a lot of adolescents playing it and stuff like that. You know, no, actually, the biographical thing I had to say to you but it's sort of, it is quite personal in the sense that so why not record it and put it out on a podcast? You know, but
yeah, let's do it.
But I think that because 13-year-old me, although obviously I had, you know, sexual feelings and motives and stuff like that, you know, like I certainly didn't think of myself as bisexual, which, you know, I do identify as bisexual as an adult and have done consciously since my sort of mid to late teens. But I think Link is like adult Link is the first male character in video games and maybe one of the first male characters that I remember having a crush on.
Really?
Yeah, and I
That's
think
fun.
and it's, I mean, you might say, I mean, I don't know how much of this I'll leave in the podcast, but, you know, maybe as a guy who tends to be attracted more towards maybe slightly more effeminate guys as well, you know, like he is kind of that, isn't he? Because he's you know, he wears the nice tights, you know, and it's kind of, I think it's quite telling, isn't it, that like, you know, Link cosplay is maybe more popular amongst female fans of the games than it is amongst male fans, you know.
Well, that's true. You know, I dressed as Link one year for Halloween and I won a costume contest.
There you go.
I did it pretty well. Yeah, I mean, and little things of the sort of Legolas traits, the long blonde hair that usually is associated to attractive women.
Yeah.
But he's got that going on.
And I think that's a way in which a lot of female, like, you know, Lord of the Rings fans and stuff, you know, got to explore that kind of side of their sexuality as well, isn't it? In liking these kind of, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with liking pretty boys or anything, but that's kind of that's a corner of sexuality that is maybe not everyone would open themselves to, you know. And
yeah, I think that's true.
And I think I was particularly aware of that on this replay through now, where, you know, I was talking about Lara Croft before, and whereas, you know, in that you've got a very, very, you know, sort of conventionally attractive woman doing all these athletic things and, you know, like pushing boulders and, you know, climbing up ledges and things like that, you know, and grunting and things like that, you know, all the sort of quasi-pornographic things that Tomb Raider did. In Ocarina of Time, you've got a more family-friendly but more kind of, you know, like maybe like an equally kind of evocative kind of stuff going on with male athleticism, you know, and it's that's certainly an angle I was looking at consciously, because I remembered having those kind of nascent feelings about Link back then, and I was kind of looking for it this time. I was kind of like, oh, you know, where are the roots of this thing you find appealing? I was like, oh yeah, they're definitely there, you know.
I feel like in some ways they strayed away from trying to make Link seem too effeminate in moments like you know the Goron King's whole thing about like brotherhood and you're my brother now and all this like, hey bro, sort of stuff. And he's like, oh, we'd like to show our appreciation with a big Goron hug, and these other Gorons drop out of the sky, and then you just have Link run. He's like, what? And he's like, no affection, right, I can't. So he goes running off, and then he's already off in the distance, and the Goron are still trudging along trying to hug him. And I thought that was actually a little bit sad.
Yeah, it is, and I mean, but then again, you know, I could harp on about sort of masculinity angle in this game forever, but you know, like you later as adult Link find that he's the Goron King has named his son after you.
Yeah.
Like whatever you've called yourself in the game, that is the name of his son. You know, it's kind of like, you know, there's just all this stuff in there which is kind of lovely. You know, like just kind of these lovely ideas of if you do heroic things, you will kind of have an influence in the world, and you know, like it's weird actually because it's a very melancholy and adult game, I think, in its themes, but it's not cynical. You know, like it is quite heartwarming and quite uplifting, and it's kind of all the more admirable that it can do all that whilst being a lot more complicated than, say, your average Mario game.
Yeah, and yet it's less complex in the sense that it's extraordinarily binary. I mean, there's some gender bending and stuff, so you know, not with gender norms, but with things like evil and good and peace and war and all of those.
Yeah.
There's no moral gray area. Like,
no, and there's stuff like, you know, there's just stuff that's like baked into a lot of fairy tales and stuff like, you know, do you remember there's this sort of selfish, like ambitious farmhand who like takes over the ranch for a bit, but then Link restores the conservative status quo. So like the family who owned the ranch is back in charge of it, and he's like really humble again because, you know, and it's just kind of, you know, I think that stuff's just so baked into our fiction that it's very hard to expunge it. And I certainly would expect one Zelda game too, you know.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I'm an anti-royalist, for example. The whole idea of this is that the royal family is sacred and special and the guardian of the realm. And, you know, this is stuff I should really not enjoy, really. You know, welcome to being British, you know. But yeah.
Maybe the sages will take over and create a you know, democratic government.
That's probably the next bit that you didn't see. You know, that's the after credits sequence.
Just off screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I feel like there is one very important thing that we didn't cover, which we can cover pretty briefly.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Because you threatened to ask me which tunic I thought was most fetching on Link.
I can't believe I missed asking you that when I was talking about how attractive he was. Yeah,
Honestly.
yeah. Which one was it? Because I'm going to go red.
You're gonna go red. Okay. I think blue.
Okay, interesting.
I think it's I was fascinated by the idea of being able to put on a tunic and then being able to breathe underwater. I just thought that was so cool. Of course, I guess I could get my fix if I ever wanted to get into scuba diving or something. But
you're wearing blue now, so
that's true. But I think blue goes just so well with blonde.
I like the way that I thought that the idea of a tunic that allows you to breathe underwater was ridiculous when I was a kid, but I didn't think a heat-resistant tunic that protected your entire body, including your open face, wasn't. I thought that seemed to make sense to me. And I was like, I don't. For some reason, that didn't seem.
Makes no sense.
Yeah, no, none of it makes any sense. But I love it. But I do particularly remember finding the red tunic Link particularly fetching. I do. I remember that from the time as well as now.
Yeah, and I think that again, that's just one of those elements that makes the game more complex and feel more lived in and more easy to really feel like you're in the world, is the fact that you can change clothes, which you really couldn't do in other games before. You could become Little Mario and Big Mario, but other than that, the sort of physical characteristics really stayed the same, and as simple as the sun coming up and going down and experiencing the cycle of the sort of life in the game world.
Yeah, that's lovely, isn't it? I mean, I guess I'll kind of, because there's so much about that sort of time cycle, including, because we didn't really talk about the sort of diurnal stuff, the day to night stuff, but like, I just had this lovely moment playing the game the other day where I was out on Lake Hylia. It's where you get the fire arrows, but you basically some little sort of tombstone inscription or something like tells you to shoot into, because the riddles are never that gnomic, are they? They're usually fairly obvious, but they tell you to basically shoot into the rising sun, and you shoot your arrow into it, and the fire arrows appear on an island as the sun rises over the lake. And I was just like, this is just incredibly mythic and lovely,
right?
And, like, it really
evocative.
Is. It's just, it's beautiful. I should just say, like, it's an absolutely beautiful game, like on every level, And I think the graphics of that era, for me at least, now have this wonderful. I mean, they were always going to have nostalgia for me, obviously, whatever they look like. But I think they've got this wonderful, dated but lovely in their datedness quality to them.
Yeah, I don't think they've dated in a way that makes them unappealing.
No.
Which is really great. When I was watching the cutscenes, I just noticed how nobody has fingers that separate from each other. They all sort of have mitten hands, and I liked it. I enjoyed watching all the mitten hand people.
Which is weird, where you're going to base a game around an ocarina, isn't it? Like,
yeah, it's really strange. And I was watching as he's holding the ocarina, it's just holding it between mitten hands, and I'm just like, how's he playing that? I don't know. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm playing it for him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we still have fingers.
I think the last thing I want to ask you before we wrap this up is, what's your favorite weapon?
Well, I was going to talk to you when we talk about navigating the geographical spaces, that like I'd just forgotten what a central part of a lot of the exploring the game space the hook shot and later the long shot is.
I was going to say the hook shot. The hook shot's the best.
It's great, isn't it? And my one quarrel from a sort of modern gaming perspective is like you realize like now when you play it that like you can't really hook into that many surfaces, including a lot of trees that clang like metal when you hit them.
Absolutely. Like, yeah. No, it makes absolutely no sense. But I think if there was one weapon I would want to have in the real world, in everyday life, and be really proficient at, it would definitely be the hook shot.
I mean, it's great, isn't it? I mean, it really, that's something that could actually get you up onto like surfaces and stuff. I actually love the boomerang, when you're a kid, because that's almost like the hook shot equivalent when you're a kid, and it's just so fun to use, and like bend around corners and things like that. Even using simple Z targeting, they base a few puzzles around that, and it's that's great fun too. Oh, I have one more thing.
Sure.
There are. I don't know if you'll remember some of these and some not, maybe. There are some terrifying bad guys in Ocarina of Time.
Oh, absolutely.
So most of the modern creatures, most of the creatures you meet are not too bad. Some of them are borderline cartoonish, and even the bosses, tend to be kind of more sort of like humorously overpowered and stuff than they are really scary.
Yeah.
There are some bone chilling, zombies in it. There's I don't know if you remember, I think they start off in this forest temple, but they recur in some other places. Do you remember those sort of hand things that are on the roof?
Yeah.
And they drop on, like the first one on this playthrough properly got me, because do you remember the shadow grows underneath your feet?
Yes. Yeah, it's genuinely really disturbing.
it's really disturbing, and they get you in one shot as well. They grab you, you're dead, and I'm like, oh my god! And I literally jumped out my skin, in a sort of child friendly game, more so than I have at most Alien films whenever I watch them. But the one I stumbled on the other day, I think it was in the Shadow Temple, was terror, like Guillermo del Toro level terrifying. It was a room where there's like these 4 pale hands sticking out of the ground.
Oh no!
And when you go near, like they don't seem to be doing anything, so you like try firing at them from far, no effect. You try going a bit near, nothing happens. You walk near one of them, it comes at you, grabs you by the hair. It's not hurting you, it just grabs you by the hair, and this thing rises up out of the ground. That there's this sort of pale, fleshy mass with this sort of red maw that's weirdly sort of hinged on its head, and it just starts like squelching towards you with this like mouth coming at you. And I was just like, what on earth is going on? Like it was like a proper like Freudian nightmare. I was like, and actually I think scarier than, I mean, I'm not a big Resident Evil fan, but I think scarier than anything I've seen in a Resident Evil game.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that made me kind of want to play the game was watching my sister running through the graveyard with the zombies, and the entire time in real life she was screaming. I mean, like a gentle scream, but just like, bah! Like she'd try and always run through it as quickly as possible, and then she would flip out if one actually confronted her. And I was just like, I want to feel this. I want to be this invested. Yeah, I want some of that.
Do you know, it's stuff. Do you remember you mentioned before, like the cinematic touches to Legend of Zelda? Do you remember when those zombies, like the sort of standard zombies that you meet as adult, like when they look at you, the action freezes and they scream?
Yes.
And Link can't move for like 3 seconds, and it's like that is terrible. That is unnerving.
It's
like
super
that's
unnerving. Yeah,
because they kind of they pivot the head swivel to wherever you are, basically, and it's like being seen as a gamer in that way is almost
nightmarishly effective.
Yeah, it's bad, man. Like that Forest Temple one shit me up. Like it genuinely did. I was like, wow, I haven't had a gaming experience like that in quite some time.
And there's such a big shift between being childhood Link and being adult Link, where you don't really get those sort of nightmarish qualities in any of the childhood events or gameplay. But then after that 7 years, boy, the world gets scary. It's like, welcome to adulthood.
Ain't that the truth? welcome to the pandemic, Link.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was worth mentioning. I'm glad we got onto that. So I mean, Kat, would you like to plug? I know we talked at length about it, which is good to get the chance to breathe more. But would you just like to remind listeners where they can find your podcast work?
Sure, yeah. In case you skipped the beginning or are just joining us now, I have a podcast with my co-host Joe Welke, and it's called the Anime Movie Podcast. It comes out weekly on Mondays, available on iTunes, Spotify, and a few other locations. We also post on YouTube. We post animations on YouTube with snippets from our show. And that's the Anime Movie Podcast channel. And we're the Anime Movie Podcast on Instagram. So find us, check us out. If you're interested in anime movies, then we are the podcast for you.
And I'm really going to challenge your memory for your scheduling now. But if all goes according to plan, this episode that we're recording now should go out on the 9th of May.
Okay.
So what will your most recent episode be then? What will people be listening to?
Our most recent episode will have been the first episode of Memories. So we're doing a 3-part series of short films that are all part of a series called Memories. And the first one will be the Magnetic Rose. So we're doing Magnetic Rose. It involves one of the directors that I love the most, which is Satoshi Kon. And it is really good. It's one of the first times that, spoiler alert, but Joe and I give it the same score, which is full marks.
Wow. And
we both really enjoyed it. So
very impressive. And I'll definitely be putting links not only to your show in the show notes, but even most specifically to the one that I guested on, because I'm that kind of host.
Absolutely.
Actually, while I still have you, I just wanted to ask you quickly, of the anime movies that you've watched whilst doing the show that you hadn't seen, before doing the show, what's your favorite? What's made the biggest impact on you?
Oh, sure. I think any of the Satoshi Kon films are really, really good. Perfect Blue, Paprika, Millennium Actress are all really, really great. I also found that I really enjoyed Mamoru Hosoda films. Summer Wars is super fun. And also Makoto Shinkai, if you're interested in seeing some really incredibly beautiful animation that's just absolutely awe-inspiring. Makoto Shinkai has some incredibly pretty things to look at.
That's great recommendation, and in fact, I think for all those shows, I stayed in the spoiler-free zone because there's not ones I've seen. So, but
Yeah.
that's at least now I know what to prioritize.
Yes.
But thank you, Kat. Thank you so much for joining me again, and I really hope to have you back in the future. I think I really can't wait to, as I say, like to play Twilight Princess and to properly have a good think about that. And I will talk to you properly about scheduling for that, because it'd be good if we both had something to roughly aim at least.
And I'd love to actually have a chance to play some of it again before we chat about it.
And maybe we can do some other collaborations in the future as well. I really look forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. And I've recorded an outro thing, so I don't need to say where you can find this show, because if you found it, you're already here, etc., etc. Thank you for listening, everyone, and you'll hear me in the future, and you'll hear Kat as well, talking about more Zelda and probably other stuff as well. So say goodbye, Kat.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @deep_Fagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.